9:02 a.m. The screens on the New York Mercantile Exchange didn't just flicker, they detonated. Traders who were sipping coffee 1 second were standing on chairs the next. The day ahead, electricity price for New York City did not rise. It did not spike. It teleported from $48 to $500, from $500 to $1 and $200. Then it hit $2,000 per megawatt hour. In under a minute, the cost of keeping Manhattan lit exploded by more than 4,000%. Elevators slowed, grid operators triggered emergency protocols, and somewhere in Ottawa, man adjusted his glasses and said absolutely nothing. This is the story of how one speech, one threat, and one miscalculation turned the most powerful country on earth into a customer with no leverage. This is the story of how Donald Trump tried to tariff electrons, and Canada answered with mathematics. 3 days earlier, at a rally packed with red hats and roaring applause, Donald Trump was in his element. He was animated. He was defiant. He was talking about trade, borders, strength. Then he pivoted north. He said Canada was taking advantage of the United States. He said America didn't need Canadian electricity. He promised that if Ottawa didn't agree to new trade terms, he would slap massive tariffs on every single electron crossing the border. The crowd cheered. Commentators laughed. It sounded like another line in a long list of tough talk. But energy is not steel. It is not lumber. It is not dairy. Energy is physics, and physics does not respond to campaign applause. In Ottawa, the reaction was not loud. It was quiet. Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former central banker who built his career managing financial crisis, did not go on television to shout. He did not fire back on social media. He called his energy advisors. He reviewed the interconnection agreements between Hydro-Quebec and the northeastern United States. He looked at the contracts, the clauses, the legal triggers, and he found leverage. For decades, the northeastern United States made a strategic decision. It shut down coal plants. It retired nuclear facilities. It blocked new gas pipelines. In their place, it built transmission lines north. Quebec's massive hydroelectric dams, colossal structures visible from space, generate more power than the province can use. That surplus flows south into New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. On many days, nearly 20% of New York City's electricity comes from Canada. In parts of New England, the dependency is even deeper. It was efficient, it was clean, it was cheap, and it created something dangerous: reliance. When Trump threatened tariffs on Canadian electricity, he broke an unwritten rule that had governed North American energy trade for half a century. Energy moved freely. Politics stayed out of the wires. The moment he introduced the idea of weaponizing that flow, he turned electricity into a bargaining chip. Carney did not cut the power. That would have been an act of open hostility. Instead, he announced a stability adjustment, a risk premium, a pricing update reflecting uncertainty in the trade environment. It sounded technical. It sounded harmless. But buried inside that language was a formula. If political instability increased, prices would automatically adjust upward. If threats escalated, so would the cost. At 9:02 a.m., that formula activated. The algorithms that managed the Northeast grid detected the new export price from Hydro-Quebec. The cost of imported electricity surged. Traders scrambled to secure supply. Utilities bid higher and higher to keep the lights on. Within seconds, the market cleared at levels no one had seen outside of a hurricane or polar vortex. Except this time, the sky over Manhattan was clear. In control rooms from Albany to Boston, engineers stared at red indicators. High prices forced tough choices. Industrial users receive alerts to reduce load immediately or face penalties. Transit systems switch to conservation mode. Backup generators are tested. Hospitals review fuel reserves. Nothing was physically broken. No dam failed. No transmission line snapped. But the economics of the grid had shifted violently. In the White House, confusion turned into anger. Reports began arriving that governors in the Northeast were demanding answers. Utility executives were warning of consumer bill shock. Markets were reacting. The dollar slipped as traders priced in the risk of sustained energy inflation. The promise that America was energy independent suddenly felt fragile because independence is not the same as interdependence. The United States produces vast amounts of oil and gas, but the Northeast grid was designed around cross-spur flows. You cannot replace thousands of megawatts overnight. You cannot build a new plant in a week. Infrastructure decisions made over 20 years cannot be reversed in 20 hours. Trump's threat was designed to show strength. Instead, it exposed vulnerability. You can tariff a product sitting in a warehouse. You cannot tariff water behind a dam without consequences. You cannot bully a supplier when your own system was built, assuming cooperation. Back on Wall Street, analysts began calculating what a sustained 4,000% surge would mean. Utilities do not absorb these costs. They pass them through. Households that were expecting a $150 electric bill could see $400 or $500 if volatility continued. Factories operating on thin margins faced impossible math, raise prices and fuel inflation, or shut down and lay off workers. Every option carried political risk. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, Carney delivered a short statement, calm, clinical. He said Canada had a duty to ensure fair value for its resources in a hostile trade climate. He did not mention Trump by name. He did not use dramatic language. He framed it as market logic. If risk rises, price rises. That is capitalism. The contrast was stark. One leader used a rally to issue a threat. The other used a pricing model to respond. By noon, the question was no longer whether the spike was real. It was how long it would last. Would the White House double down and escalate? Would governors pressure Washington to de-escalate? Would markets stabilize if rhetoric cooled? Or had a line been crossed that would permanently redefine North American energy politics? The lights in Manhattan were still on. The trains were still running. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. The assumption that energy would always be there, always be affordable, always be insulated from politics, that assumption was gone. Trump wanted leverage over Canada. Instead, Canada found leverage over the grid. And when the price of electricity jumps from $48 to $2,000 in half a minute, it is no longer a talking point. It is a warning. This is only the first phase of the crisis, because when power becomes political, the consequences do not stay in one control room. They ripple through markets, through households, through alliances. And the next 48 hours will determine whether this was a shock that fades or the moment the Northeast discovered how fragile its foundation really is. By 10:17 a.m., the crisis stopped being a market story and became a political one. Governors across the Northeast were no longer asking what happened. They were asking how long this would last. New York's energy commissioner was on a call with grid operators, staring at projections that looked like a heart attack on a screen. If prices held anywhere near those levels, utilities would have no choice but to trigger emergency conservation programs. Large industrial customers would be forced offline first, then rolling reductions, then controlled outages. Boston's mayor was briefed that subway frequency might need to be reduced if the grid tightened further, not because there was no electricity, but because the cost of securing it had become punishing. Electricity markets don't collapse with explosions. They collapse with invoices. And the invoices were coming. Inside the White House, advisors tried to spin the surge as temporary volatility. They told reporters the United States had plenty of domestic energy. Technically, that was true. America produces enormous amounts of natural gas. It drills, it fracks, it exports. But production is not the same thing as delivery. The pipelines that would bring more gas into New England were never built. Environmental lawsuits blocked them. State regulators delayed them. Nuclear plants were shut down before replacements were ready. The grid was redesigned around imports. That decision had seemed smart for years. Clean, cheap hydro from Quebec filled the gap. Carbon. Emissions dropped. Consumers saved money. Politicians took credit. But now the same integration looked like exposure. The Energy Secretary reportedly laid out the math in blunt terms. Replacing even half of the Canadian imports would require restarting dormant fossil fuel plants or rushing emergency fuel contracts. That takes time, permits, logistics, and even if it could be done, the cost would still be far higher than the old hydro contracts. There was no quick switch to flip. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, something even more strategic was unfolding. Carney wasn't just adjusting prices, he was shaping perception. Canadian officials quietly briefed European diplomats that Canada was responding to unpredictable trade aggression. They emphasized that Canada remained a reliable partner so long as agreements were respected. The message was subtle but powerful. Instability was not coming from Ottawa. Markets listened to narratives as much as numbers. Currency traders noticed. The US dollar dipped against several major currencies as investors recalculated political risk. Bond yields twitched higher on fears that sustained energy inflation would complicate monetary policy. If electricity bills surged across the Northeast, inflation data would follow. If inflation rose, interest rates could remain elevated. If rates stayed high, growth would slow, a chain reaction triggered by a speech. Back in New York, Con Edison executives were in emergency meetings. Utilities operate on regulated margins. They don't speculate. They purchase power, distribute it, and recover costs from customers. If the wholesale price quadruples or more, that shock does not disappear. It flows downstream. Analysts began estimating that an average household in the region could see bills rise by hundreds of dollars if the pricing regime remained in place, even for a single billing cycle. For families already stretched by rent and groceries, that number is not abstract. It is the difference between savings and debt. Factories felt it first. In upstate New York, aluminum processors received automated notices encouraging voluntary load reductions. Crypto mining facilities, which depend entirely on cheap power, shut down within hours. Their business model evaporated the moment electricity crossed a certain threshold. Data centers began reviewing backup contracts. Every megawatt mattered, and yet no one had turned off a switch. That was the genius and the danger of the strategy. Canada did not cut supply. It simply repriced risk. If Washington wanted stability, it could lower the temperature. If it escalated rhetoric, the algorithm would do the rest. The punishment was embedded in the market itself. Privately, some Republican lawmakers began to worry. Energy insecurity is politically toxic. Voters forgive many things, but not darkness and high bills. Calls between Senate offices and state governors intensified. The message from the Northeast was clear. This cannot continue. But Trump's political brand had always been built on confrontation. Backing down publicly carried its own risk. Supporters expected strength. Allies expected consistency. Opponents expected volatility. The room for maneuver was shrinking. Cable news panels framed it as a test of resolve. Was this a temporary standoff, or the beginning of a prolonged economic duel? Commentators argued over who blinked first. Yet beneath the noise, grid operators were doing something far less dramatic and far more important, recalculating reserve margins hour by hour. If a cold front moved in unexpectedly, demand would spike. If a major plant tripped offline, capacity would tighten. In a tightly balanced system, confidence matters. Once traders believe scarcity is possible, prices jump preemptively. Fear becomes embedded in bids. That fear was spreading. Hospitals reviewed generator fuel levels. University campuses discussed contingency plans. Transit authorities prepared public statements just in case. None of them wanted to cause panic, but all of them understood the same thing. Modern cities are electrical organisms. Every elevator, server, and signal light depends on stable voltage. Across the border, Hydro-Quebec engineers monitored exports calmly. The dams were steady. Water levels were normal. Turbines spun with quiet indifference. The physical system was fine. It was the political overlay that had changed. Carney's approval ratings in Canada began climbing almost immediately. Many Canadians had long felt that trade negotiations favored Washington. Now they saw a prime minister using economic logic rather than loud rhetoric. To them, it looked disciplined. To critics in the United States, it looked ruthless. By late afternoon, the White House faced three unattractive options: escalate and risk deeper economic pain, retreat and appear to concede, or attempt a quiet negotiation that both sides could frame as victory. Each path carried consequences not just for energy prices, but for credibility, because this was no longer about a tariff line in a speech. It was about whether North American interdependence could survive political brinkmanship. It was about whether markets would trust that energy flows would remain insulated from campaign strategy. As evening approached, wholesale prices eased slightly from their peak, but they remained dramatically higher than normal. The message was unmistakable. Stability had a price now, and that price was being calculated in real time. The lights were still on in Manhattan. The skyline still shimmered. But the certainty that powered it had cracked, and once confidence in a grid begins to fracture, restoring it is far harder than flipping a breaker. The next move would decide whether this becomes a brief shock or the opening chapter of a deeper economic confrontation that neither side can easily